Tales from the Break Room is a viewer submission show, and we want to hear your scariest work stories. Send them to us at eeriecast.com/submit. But if you don't want to be paid, send it to us at darkstories.org instead. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
If you've worked retail, chances are you've had to work in returns a time or two. That's where the fussiest of customers go, either with valid complaints or sometimes even trying to scam you. But in one of today's stories, a very crazed customer has a very different kind of return, you could say. A squishy, slimy one. Make it to the 7th story and you'll see what I'm talking about. So grab your favorite roast of coffee and join me in the back as I relax and share these new scary work stories with you. These are tales from the break room. A museum full of ghosts. From Bree. I grew up in a semi-rural county in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's a beautiful area, full of trees and gently rolling hills, not too far from the Delaware River. In the autumn, the whole place looks like a postcard, with vivid fall colors, apple orchards, and pumpkin patches everywhere you turn. The area is also rich in history, due to its proximity to Philadelphia and Valley Forge, with many pre-Revolutionary War buildings still standing. More than a dozen of them operate as hotels, restaurants, or B&Bs, with several boasting a common area marketing slogan, "George Washington slept here." The locals like to wink at this and joke that if all the claims are true, Washington must have slept in a different building every night for at least 5 years. And of course, like any place with strong historical ties and a fair bit of longevity behind it, we had our share of ghost stories. There were indeed ghosts in the Mnar Hills. From an early age, I was surrounded by history and tales of the supernatural, and I quickly fell in love with both. When I was in my first year of college, I got a part-time work-study job with the local historical society. The offices were housed in one of the many museums in the county, and they were in need of someone to help with a cataloging project. This was back in the early 2000s, when many institutions were making the switch from physical records to digital ones. My job was to go through the museum's paper files, take note of any gaps in the records, then go find the missing items in their vast collection of pre-industrial revolution artifacts. This presented something of a challenge, since the museum was 6 stories tall and had thousands of pieces on display, with a certain amount of climbing and bending required that the older staff members were not keen on doing. A nice limber college student was just what the docent ordered, so twice a week I took up my notepad and pencil and traipsed through the building in search of lost objects. It was definitely a learning experience, as well as a treasure hunt, and I was thrilled to be doing it. While I climbed endless stairs and shriveled my fingers to sandpaper on dusty old file folders, I daydreamed of one day becoming a permanent part of the staff, perhaps even holding a curatorial or archival position once I got my degree. Unfortunately, this was not to be, as I ended up moving to another state after college. But I remember my time at that museum very fondly. It gave me a lot of very useful work experience, to say nothing of the value of a regular paycheck to every broke college student. And it left me with a few spooky stories I love to share. Now, I'll be leaving out the name of the museum, but anyone local to the area or familiar with it will probably recognize some of the following descriptions. It's one of 3 area museums designed and built in a fairly distinctive style by a local archaeologist and artifact collector in the early years of the 20th century. My first day on the job, the curator told me, "This is an old building full of old stuff. Somebody sees weird things here pretty much every week. It's never anything bad, but if you get spooked, just go talk to the receptionist in the lobby, or come back to the office and have some coffee, and you should be fine." The matter-of-fact way this was put to me was a little surprising, but I quickly learned that nearly everyone on the staff had experienced something at some point, and they just took such things in stride. All part of the job, I guess. and it wasn't long before the spirits of the museum came out to greet the newest arrival. The first things I noticed were the smells. The museum itself was a massive building constructed of poured concrete, so the galleries and walkways were charmingly irregular in shape, and with many of the exhibits hanging from the walls and ceilings on open-air display, there were distinctive scents in different parts of the building. The typical scent profile of the place was dry and cool, with pleasant hints of old wood, paper, and clay tile. The library gallery had that beautiful aroma of old books and leather and binding glue. The rooms of farming implements in the Franklin Stove Gallery carried a tang of iron. On warm days, the massive printing press on one of the middle floors still smelled a little bit like ink. What caught my attention was a particular staircase between a room full of old stove plates and the roof gallery. During the construction of the building, a dog belonging to the museum's founder had run up the stairway while the concrete was still setting. Chesapeake Bay Retrievers aren't exactly a small breed, and his paws left distinct impressions on several of the steps. Far from being particularly angry, his owner was amused and decided to leave the paw prints intact, even naming the stairway after his beloved pooch. My second week at the museum, I was on my way up to the roof gallery when the distinct scent of dog suddenly filled the space. When I looked down, I happened to be standing on one of the stairs featuring the aforementioned dog's paw prints. More puzzled and amused than frightened, I just shook my head and continued on with my work. I later learned that this was a pretty typical experience on those particular stairs. Dogs weren't even allowed in the museum when I worked there. But still, the distinctive smell of one lingered around those steps. Interestingly, on rainy days, one could occasionally smell a wet dog on the stairs. Maybe the ghost pup had a penchant for running around in the puddles. Less pleasant was a horse-drawn hearse wagon, which had once been used to carry coffins in funeral processions. It was a lovely piece in excellent condition, still retaining a good deal of its original black and gold lacquer, but it always made me feel uneasy. On warm days, there would always be a handful of flies buzzing around the area, despite there being no flies to be seen anywhere else in the building. Once, while walking by the exhibit, I caught a whiff of something gag-inducing, like when you clean out your fridge in the spring and find a container of egg salad from last year's Labor Day picnic. I made excuses to stay away from that floor for a solid week afterward, but thankfully, I never smelled it again. In another area of the museum, there was a children's exhibit, which would feature rotating exhibits of things like toys, schoolroom furniture, depictions of animals, guessing games, or scavenger hunts. More than once, I passed by that room around closing time, and I would hear children talking or giggling inside. I would quickly duck inside to make sure that any lingering guests were aware that it was time to leave. But without fail, the space would be empty. On one occasion, I was tasked with tidying up the room and putting the various touch-friendly pieces back in their place for the next day. I completed the job, turned out the lights, and reported back to the curator's office before going home for the night. The following day, I was reprimanded. They said I'd failed to finish tidying up the children's room. When I insisted that I had finished and reminded the curator that I checked in with him before leaving, I was told that one of the maintenance staff who came to open the building found the room in disarray. Toys and puzzles and children's furniture strewn all over the place. Not sure what to do, I insisted I had cleaned up, but I also promised that I'd make doubly sure the next time. I was only asked to tidy up the room one more time during my tenure, but once I was done, I paused in the doorway and said in my nicest aspiring elementary school teacher voice, "Okay, kids, playtime is over. It's time to sleep for a while and let the toys get their rest. We can play more tomorrow." The room was still neatly in order the following day. My final tale is less a single experience and more an accumulation of events that seemed perfectly normal at the time and only became scary in hindsight. Over the course of my time with the museum, I got to be familiar with most of the staff. There wasn't a lot of turnover, and those I didn't know by name I at least knew by sight. And like anyone else who's terrible with names, I would just offer a smile and a nod, or a wave, when we ran into each other. Some of them would smile and wave back, while others would just go about their business. Museum people aren't always the most social types, and I happen to know that most of them dreaded the annual fundraising galas that required a long evening of social niceties and small talk. I'm not exactly an extrovert myself, so I didn't really take offense at being ignored. Honestly, sometimes it was a relief to not have to engage my brain's highly reluctant social protocols when I was trying to focus on counting a tray full of hat pins or hunt down the catalog number of one particular lobster trap in a room full of fishing equipment. So, when an older man with a mustache and dark gray suit ignored my salutation, I did not think anything of it. I would see him around the museum from time to time, usually walking through one of the galleries or exiting a room I had just entered. On one occasion, I walked into the reading room of the library, and I saw him on the upper level of the two-story space, browsing one of the shelves on the small mezzanine and looking quite intent on finding a particular volume. Knowing how much I hated being interrupted when looking for something, I just quietly got the item I'd come in for and tiptoed out of the room. I couldn't recall being introduced to the man, but it was just as likely that my sieve of a brain had just misplaced the recollection. And he didn't seem pressed, so I wasn't bothered. For the same reason, I never mentioned his presence to the curator or any of my coworkers. Nothing about his appearance was strange, and nothing about our encounters was the least bit odd to me, so I didn't pay him much mind. It wasn't until a holiday party at one of the other associated museums that I got the shock of my college-aged life. While touring the personal residence of the museum's founder, I happened to find a familiar face. It was the older man with the gray suit and mustache, except he wasn't one of the party guests. His portrait was hanging over the doorway to one of the rooms. A cold chill went down my spine. It felt like someone had just walked over my grave. When I asked who the man in the portrait was, my coworker gave me a knowing smile and said, "I see you've met Henry." I suppose it won't surprise anyone to learn that the man in the gray suit was the museum's founder. He was known to appear in all three of the museums from time to time, as if visiting his old stomping grounds or continuing to enjoy the collections he'd worked so hard to build. He was a busy and very dedicated man in life, often eschewing holidays in order to keep plugging away at his research and various projects. Perhaps it's unsurprising then that a little thing like an expiration date on a headstone would not be enough to keep old Henry from his work. I moved on to other work soon after, serving my time in both retail and food service hell, but I still treasure my time at that work-study job. My life and interests continued to revolve around history and education, and a decade or so later, quite by accident, I found myself working for a different historical society in another state. I just had to smile when one of my office mates jokingly warned me that the nearby historical area was heavily haunted. "You might even see some ghosts walking around the place," she told me with a smooth southern drawl and a theatrical waggle of her fingers. "Oh, don't worry," I replied. "Wouldn't be my first time." The museum in Pennsylvania still stands, and as far as I know, its founder still visits every now and again, and his dog still makes a game of running up his namesake stairs. Uber Nightmare from Stixxel. It was close to 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night when I got the pickup request on my Uber app. I'd been driving around the industrial part of town for over an hour without a single fare. This area gets pretty deserted late at night, so I was thankful for any request that came through. I followed the directions to the pickup spot, an alleyway squeezed between two warehouses. Pulling up to the location, I strained my eyes, searching for the passenger in the shadows. After a moment, I saw movement near the dumpster. A figure emerged, walking slowly towards my car. I popped the locks open as they approached the back door. I greeted them when they got in, but they didn't say anything back. I noticed the passenger was wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over their head, so I couldn't really make out any features. They just slumped silently in the back seat. I confirmed the address with them for the destination. All they did was nod slightly under their hood in response. "Okay then, here we go," I said, trying to sound upbeat. I pulled away from the curb, ready for a nice, easy trip. At the first stop sign, I reflexively glanced in the rearview mirror to get a better look at my passenger. Instead of a face, though, all I saw was blank, empty space under the hood. No eyes, no nose, no mouth whatsoever. I jerked the mirror down, thinking it must have been angled wrong. But still only emptiness where facial features should be. My heart started pounding as I looked back over my shoulder. The hood was still pulled forward, concealing any face. I whipped my eyes back to the road, gripping the steering wheel tight. What in the world was going on, I wondered. I stared straight ahead as I began to drive again, trying to process what I saw, or what I thought I saw. Maybe it was just a trick of the light in that alleyway. After a few deep breaths, I cautiously glanced in the mirror again. My stomach dropped. There was still only blankness under that hood. I managed to keep my voice steady as I said, "Just confirming the destination again. It's Main Street, right?" The hooded figure nodded once more, muttering something incomprehensible in reply. As we drove into the night, I periodically checked the back mirror again and again, hoping to see anything that resembled human features, but that void just stared back each time. Desperate to think about anything else besides my impossible passenger, I tried making conversation. "Quiet night so far, huh?" I said with forced casualness. More garbled mumbling came in response. I prattled on about the weather and other inane topics, but continued to get nothing back except occasional cryptic murmurs. I followed my GPS into an industrial park full of warehouses and factories. As we pulled into the destination street, the passenger spoke for the first time in a gravelly voice. "Here," they rasped. My hands tightened on the wheel at the sound. I looked back again at the nightmarish hooded figure, willing this bizarre ride to be over. I pulled over to the curb. I put the car in park, expecting the passenger to finally exit, but they just sat there, making no move to get out. The engine idled as I hesitantly said, "So, this is the right place?" A single raspy word came from under the hood. "Wait." My heart sank again. Wait for what? I watched the empty street, completely lost about what was happening. I wondered if I should just take off and leave this crazy passenger behind, but some instinct told me to not make any sudden moves. A bead of sweat trickled down my temple as I gripped the steering wheel, hoping that the passenger would just get out. After what felt like forever, the hooded figure suddenly lunged forward, one gloved hand pointing out the window. It made me jump in my seat. I then followed the sightless gaze. A shape emerged from the darkness up ahead. A person, or what used to be a person. I mean, it looked human in shape, but the way it staggered and lurched didn't seem natural. I watched, petrified, as it shambled closer in the dim streetlights. The more I saw of its jerky, awkward movements, the more unease filled me. It drew nearer until I could make out tattered clothing hanging from its misshapen frame. The skin was visible, and it looked pasty and sickly in the pale light. It didn't seem aware of anything, focusing only on its shambling walk. Revulsion hit me as a recognition dawned. This thing looked like a zombie or ghoul straight out of a horror film, somehow set loose on this abandoned street. Before I could even react, the passenger opened the door next to them. The shambling thing outside angled towards the open door and fell into the back seat with a heavy thud. I recoiled away from the sight of it, sitting inches from the faceless passenger. A stench wafted up to me that was beyond disgusting. All of this was too much. 2 nightmares in my car that were beyond belief, beyond explanation. I was gripped by raw panic then, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I had to get out of here. As I fumbled desperately to put the car in drive, my eyes were glued at the horrific things in the back seat. How could this be real? The 2 of them sat motionless side by side. Neither made any threatening move, but their mere presence filled me with visceral dread. Blinking hard, I turned back to throw the car into drive. Get away, just get away, I told myself, breathing raggedly. I hit the gas and the tires squealed as I peeled away from the curb. When I looked back again, the passenger and his companion were gone. I stared open-mouthed at the now empty seats, then frantically checking the sidewalks and side streets. There was no sign of them anywhere. The only traces left behind were these dark wisps of shadow floating in the air where they'd been sitting. But even that didn't remain long. It's been so long now, but I still shudder thinking about that terrible ride. I quit working for Uber soon after. I know it sounds cliché, but think about it. Those things, whatever they were real. And if I kept driving for Uber on those streets alone at night, they could appear again. And I just can't take that risk. I'd rather find a new job than encounter those things ever again. Shenanigans in Florida. From Emma D. This is an account of what happened to my husband when he was working as a trainer quite some time ago. We collaborated to put this story together for submission. Adam, not his real name, and I had been married for about 1.5 years when this happened. As his wife, I can attest this was the most terrifying thing I think he's ever experienced. That's saying a lot, considering he's been a firefighter for years. On to the story from his perspective. I was a trainer for a moving company, which we'll call U-Tote. I'd worked my way up from an on-call diesel mechanic to trainer, and as such I traveled across the country. I've been to all the 48 contiguous states, and even made my way to Alaska and Hawaii. I love to travel. This was an amazing experience for me, and I didn't have to pay a dime. As my wife had just had our first baby, I would be starting as a shop foreman for the company, so I could be closer to home. This would be my last turnout. Miami, Florida, to be exact. It was spring, and the place was loaded with spring breakers. No worry, I had a hotel room already reserved for me, and there was a restaurant attached, so I didn't have to walk anywhere. I didn't have a vehicle anyway. The foreman at the shops I was training in would pick me up and take me where I needed to go. After an especially long day of training, I was ready for a good meal. The best part? The aforementioned restaurant was a place my wife and I liked to eat at when we were dating. They'd since closed locations near us, so I was excited to go, to knock back a few drinks and some good food at Shenanigans. Normally I sit at the bar, but that night I figured I would sit at a table. My mistake. After my first Long Island iced tea, I started to get sleepy, a little too relaxed. It had been a rough week. Cleveland, Ohio, Lexington, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, Augusta, Georgia, and finally Miami, Florida. As much as I did love to travel, I had to admit this was really hitting me harder than usual. I was exhausted. I was all fat and happy, as my dad used to say after a good dinner. I'd had 2 Long Island iced teas total that had gone down really well with my surf and turf dinner. I was thinking about dessert, but I was too tired by then. I drank the last bit of water and went to stand up. I remember yawning so hard I thought my jaw would snap. I put my wallet in my back jeans pocket, as usual, and I began to walk past the bar to the door. The bartender smiled and nodded at me. I nodded back, the usual bro nod. Then a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, sir, you dropped your wallet." Then that person handed it to me. We had a light conversation as we headed out the door. Then I woke up, in my hotel room, completely confused. I was still dressed and lying on top of the comforter, glasses still on my face. My wallet was on my stomach. In one fluid motion, I pushed it off of me as I sat up. My eyes darted around the room looking for something, anything that made sense. The only thing out of place was my fully clothed self on top of the bed. What the heck, I thought. What the actual heck? Sweating, heart pounding, I stood up and swayed. I sat back down with a whoosh at the foot of the bed. I gave myself a once-over in the mirror across from me. No bruises, no black eyes, no strange facial tattoos. My hands were shaking, but they were okay. No needle marks on my arms. I checked under the rest of my clothing. I was okay. What in the actual world happened to me? I felt like Winnie the Pooh pointing to his brain saying, "Think, think, think." Nothing was coming back. I remembered walking out of that restaurant with that guy, and then I was here. I snatched my wallet up off the floor where it had landed. Everything was all there. Debit card, driver's license, phone card. Well, at least they didn't take that. I'd had my company phone card lifted before. I kinda chuckled at the time when my wife called to ask me if I'd called Zimbabwe. But this was different. I looked again, nothing. Absolutely nothing was missing from my wallet. Even my 10 singles were in there. I called my wife. I wanted to hear her voice. I needed to know she and the baby were fine, as I did not feel fine at all. "Hey, you on your way?" She started happily, but I cut her off. Emma, something happened to me. I don't remember anything after dinner. I woke up here in my hotel room. Nothing's missing. I don't remember. My head feels like cotton." Silence. Then Emma spoke. "Is the door locked?" she asked. I furrowed my brow. "Dunno. Let me check." I went over, checked the lock. Locked from the inside. "Yeah, it is. I guess I had to have done that, right?" I told her. That meant I had to have been somewhat cognizant, but dang, I don't remember even doing that. "Did you tell anyone? Front desk? Maybe they saw you with somebody. Did you call the cops?" "No, I'd done nothing like that." I answered. "No, I just want to come home. If I do that, I'll miss my flight. I just want to come home." As much as she understood, she really felt I should make a report. "I'm sure your boss can arrange a different flight for you." What good would it do? I mean, I think it might have been the guy that handed me my wallet. I think I was drugged. I was so tired. Then it hit me. What if the bartender and that guy were in some sort of racket together? They could have made a killing at that restaurant. Thousands of dollars a night. If they had a group of, say, 5, they could easily get over 20 grand. I remember the nod from the bartender the night before. Maybe it wasn't for me. Maybe it was signaling the guy behind him, the guy that gave me my wallet. Well, if they do have some kind of arrangement, maybe your report could be the last one to tie it up. You really should get to a hospital and get checked out. Not to be scary, but who knows what they did to you. I then heard a keyboard tapping on the other side. Emma was looking up something. "Oh no," she said angrily. $250 is gone from our account. I was angry too. "Listen, I just want to come home. Can you come get me at the usual time at the airport, Delta Gate? I love you, gotta go." Was it the best idea ever, just to come home? No, I should have reported it, because I found out we wouldn't be able to get that money back after I told the bank. Why? Because when they pulled the security footage, I was the one making the withdrawal. When I saw the footage myself, I was standing utterly alone at the ATM making that withdrawal. I wasn't looking at anyone. I wasn't talking to anyone. Had they been off camera threatening me with a gun? Whispering, "Just look normal and you'll be fine." It was just me and myself alone. Stone cold serious face, no emotion. I even put the money into my darned wallet. But remember how I said I didn't have a vehicle? That means someone I didn't know had to drive me from the restaurant to the ATM and back to the hotel. Talk about sending chills up your spine. This brings me to present day. I never had any kind of physical reaction to whatever it was they gave me, but it played with me mentally for quite a while. I'm an over-the-road truck driver now. Give me a little time, I might have some stories for you there. Take care, and always stay aware of your surroundings. Doctor's Office Ghost. From Caitlin. My story takes place at my current place of employment. I was recently hired as an operations assistant at a medical office for seniors. When I first came to this office, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Then again, who goes into a new job thinking the place is haunted? From what I'm told, it seems these walls in the office have seen many events over the years. Sick patients, breaking bad news, even having patients rushed out due to extreme medical cases. My first encounter with the office ghost in question happened a month into my job. I usually am the last one out of the office since I have to finish up notes in my patients' charts and handle unscanned items for the day. It was about 5:30 p.m., and as I was typing away, hoping to get out soon, I heard the very familiar sound of the wheelchair lock. Forgetting what time it was and that the office was closed, I didn't lose focus, but I did say out loud, "Do you need help with that?" After I said this, I realized I was alone in the office. It was 30 minutes after closing, after all. I then heard the noise of the lock again, this time the foot pedal locking into place. That was enough for me. I gathered my belongings quickly, saying goodnight and leaving. The next day, I was chatting with my coworker. I mentioned my encounter, then quickly followed up with, "I might be a little paranoid." She was quiet, and then explained they believed there was a spirit in the office. Even she had experienced things while closing. The next few closings were uneventful, until about a week later. I was closing up and walking through the hallway when I heard the crinkling noise of the paper we used to cover the patients' chairs. I slowly started to approach the room. The door was shut, but I heard the noise again. Don't ask me where I got the courage to do so, but I opened the door. To my shock, there was an indent on the fresh paper, as if someone had been sitting there. The hairs on my neck started to tingle, and I felt uneasy. I took that as my sign to go. I went a while without any encounter, and I thought maybe that was it. That's all I'm going to experience. But it happened just last week. While getting ready to close, I was in the back supply closet restocking the lab when I heard a crystal clear and audible "Hello" in my right ear. I freaked out, dropping my items and leaving the closet. I didn't go back in until I had a coworker with me. Since then, I've gotten into the habit of saying good morning and good night to whatever spirits lurk here. Hopefully, I'm on their good side. What I saw while patrolling. From Cricket Girl 20. When I was in foster care, my foster mom's friend knew I loved animals, so he offered me a job patrolling his private property, which included some woods. Being around nature excited me, so I said yes, and the pay was good. I would take the two big dogs with me, Baby, a Mastiff, and Bella, a St. Bernard Great Pyrenees mix. All I had to do was make sure no one was messing around, and in the woods I had to ensure the trail cameras were still up and that deer feeders were full. Normally I would hear birds, squirrels, and occasionally see a mama deer and her baby. But one day it was very quiet. This gave me chills. I'm part Cherokee Indian, and I believe in all of the Indian folklore creatures. As I neared the end of my patrol, I got a feeling like I was being watched, so I stopped. Baby and Bella went on alert, their heads quickly jerking to the right, and they started to growl. These were two normally quiet dogs. I slowly turned, and at first, I saw nothing. Then I heard our friend's voice say, "Cricket, come here. I found something you'd like." But I knew that he was out doing errands. Suddenly, the creature came into view. Something that looked like a deer, but this walked on two legs. I saw its mouth move, and my friend's voice came out. I turned and ran from the monstrous sight with Baby and Bella hot on my heels. I heard the thing run after me, continuing to fake my friend's voice. I prayed I would find my way out of the woods. I have to admit I felt like crying. It takes me a lot to get scared, and this scared me for sure. Eventually, I ran through the tree line just as my friend pulled up in his pickup. I collapsed at his front door, out of breath. Once he helped me inside, I told him what I saw. He looked away for a moment, then soon replied, "This land used to be native land. My great-grandfather purchased it in 1878. He's the one that first saw that creature. Stories of sightings of that thing have been passed down. The creature doesn't mess with me, but I think it sensed that you're not a relative. It wanted to make its presence known to you. My great-grandfather started a tradition of offering animal remains to it, so it doesn't mess with me or my family. I'm sorry, I should have told you, but I believed it wouldn't mess with you." After sitting in shock for a second, I asked, "What kind of animals do you offer?" "Deer and coyotes." He explained if I offered an animal, it probably wouldn't mess with me again. So the next day, I put a freshly killed deer in a pull wagon, took it to the same place where I saw it before, and placed the deer on the ground, calling out, "I'm sorry for disturbing you. I come in peace." And I never did see it again after that. I continued to patrol my friend's property until the day I went home to my real mom. I'll never forget that day, and I'm thankful that Baby and Bella sensed that creature. If it hadn't been for their warning, I'm not sure what would have happened. I know the saying, dogs are man's best friend, but sometimes dogs go above and beyond that title and become heroes, choosing to save their master from danger instead of running away. Though Baby and Bella didn't fight the creature, their warning saved me just in time. I miss those two very much. Who were they? From Cassandra. I've been in many near-death situations, but this one still sticks with me to this day, as I wouldn't know what I would have done if it went south. About 1.5 years ago, I worked at this small grocery store as a cashier. I was scheduled to work with my best friend that evening. She was the one who got me the job, seeing as we've been friends for over 11 years as of today. I was on the main till, and we had a backup till as well. When working with someone, we switched up who was on which till. Otherwise, if you worked alone, you were on the main till. I was taking over checking out customers, while my friend was doing the cleaning for the night. We tended to have an agreement when we worked together. It was a slow day and I was on my phone. The bosses didn't mind as long as no customers were around. Due to some medical issues, I have a hard time standing for long periods, so I tended to squeeze myself into the small cube where we keep the bags to sit. This area could only fit about 2 employees at a time and was open, but customers knew not to pass through. I heard the door open and I saw the biggest group of guys, about 8 if I remember correctly. I greeted them, not thinking much of it. They took their time getting what they needed. My friend motioned for me to come over to her while quietly saying my name. Confused, I asked her why. She told me she had a very bad feeling that they could potentially rob us based on their behavior. Our procedure was that if we felt uncomfortable or unsafe, we could have one of the guys working in the back stand with us. "Do you think we could have one of the guys come out here?" I suggested, also asking a question. She tried to make her way to the back, but got caught up in helping. Now, these were not normal-looking men. They looked like a gang. I was waiting and noticed that the men started surrounding me, 2 on one side, 2 near the exit, 2 on the opposite side, and 2 near the back wall. Why would they position themselves like that? My heart began pounding, and I was nearly in tears. I didn't want them to see this, so I backed up close to the store phone in case. I was supposed to be the one checking out these guys, but my friend saw how scared I was, so she decided to do it herself. She made small talk, and you could hear the panic in her voice. The 2 of us were prepared for one of these guys to pull a gun. One of the men pulled out a bunch of $100 bills, throwing down one. We had markers to make sure the money wasn't fake. The bill passed, and she handed him the change. He smiled, and they left. I felt a bit of relief. My friend stood next to the door, watching. They left on 4-wheelers, each one with a shotgun on the side. One of them winked at her before they left. Let's just say we were both jumpy for the rest of the shift. What's in the bag? From Cindy L. This happened years ago when I was a teenager, working the closing shift at a corner store in the outskirts of my hometown of Denton, Texas. I'm not using the real name of the store, so let's just call it Mike's Corner Mart, for anonymity's sake. The store was in a pretty isolated part of town, on a street that didn't have much around, besides some warehouses and empty fields. The road was poorly lit too, so at night the parking lot and surrounding area felt dark and desolate. I always got a little spooked leaving there late at night by myself. Anyway, this particular night, it was a Tuesday around 9 p.m. if I remember right, and it had been a slow and peaceful evening up until then. I was hoping to get through the last hour or so of my shift without any issues and close up shop sooner rather than later. But of course, that did not end up being the case. Things were quiet when the bell on the front door suddenly jingled, announcing a customer entering the otherwise empty store. I looked up to see a disheveled man shuffling in. He looked around 30 years old maybe, tall and lanky with messy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. But what really struck me right away was his face. His eyes were wide and darting around the store rapidly, like he was paranoid someone might jump out at him. And he was muttering something under his breath in a strange way, which right away gave me the creeps. This guy definitely didn't seem right. The man began wandering up and down the aisles, perusing items while continuing to mumble and talk to himself. I tried to keep my distance by busying myself, cleaning up and straightening merchandise behind the counter. Honestly, I was hoping if I ignored him, he'd get what he needed quickly and leave. No such luck, however. After wandering the aisles for several minutes, muttering under his breath, the disheveled man eventually made his way up to the counter with an armful of various items. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to engage with him any more than I had to. But of course, it was my job to check him out. So, reluctantly, I started to ring up his items. As I was scanning his things and bagging them, I noticed the man had a fanny pack around his waist. He kept digging around in it. He would pull out a variety of little gadgets, pocket knives, loose batteries, strange assortments of junk, really. The more he rummaged around in the pack, the more agitated he seemed to get. His movements grew quicker and more erratic, his constant mumbling becoming louder and more insistent. I was extremely unnerved at this point, but I tried to stay professional and pleasant. I made some innocuous small talk, asking routine questions like, "Did you find everything okay?" And, "Do you have your rewards card?" But my attempts to be polite only seemed to upset him even more. He became increasingly irritable, glaring at me, grumbling angrily in response. Finally, I finished bagging all his items and told him the total, feeling relieved this encounter was almost over. Hastily, he pulled a wad of cash out of his fanny pack and shoved it at me. He then grabbed the bags in a frenzy. I called out, "Thank you, have a good night," as he rushed for the exit. But in his manic state, he had left one nondescript plastic shopping bag on the counter. I contemplated just leaving it overnight. Maybe he'd come back for it. But something compelled me to check what he'd forgotten. A decision I would soon forget. As the front door slammed shut behind the troubled man, I stared down at the plain plastic shopping bag he had pulled out of his fanny pack earlier and left behind. I looked out the big front windows, but I couldn't see which direction the man had gone after leaving the store. The whole encounter left me feeling unsettled. After a moment of debate, I picked up the bag and cautiously peered inside. At first, it looked pretty innocuous. Some basic toiletry items like deodorant and toothpaste, nothing too concerning. But something seemed off. I moved the items around, noticing the bag felt too heavy for just those few little items. Feeling along the bottom inside, my pulse quickened as I felt around, and my fingers landed on something wet and slimy. It rolled slightly at my touch. Fighting back nausea, I forced myself to grip it between my thumb and forefinger. Slowly, I extracted my hand from the bag. I nearly dropped the object as I realized I was holding a human eyeball between my shaking fingers. Shock and disgust crashed over me in a wave. I stumbled back from the counter, struggling not to be sick. This couldn't be real. What should I do? Why did that man have a human eyeball concealed in his bag? My mind raced, heart pounding wildly. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I stood paralyzed behind the counter, trembling uncontrollably as I held the disembodied human eyeball between two fingers. After getting over the initial shock, I forced myself to think rationally about what to do next. I couldn't just ignore this and go about my business like nothing happened. But would anyone even believe me if I reported finding an eyeball that a stranger left in my store? They might think it was some kind of prank, or that I was crazy. But I knew in my gut something had to be done. This went beyond just being creeped out. Someone had maybe lost an eye, either by force or willingly. And the man had seemed so unstable when he was here just minutes ago. Hands shaking, I grabbed a few paper towels, gingerly wrapping up the eyeball so I wouldn't have to look at it anymore. Carefully, I placed it back in the bag, closing it up. I then picked up the store phone with trembling fingers. I dialed 911, praying they would send someone who would know how to handle this insane situation. I frantically peered out the windows into the dark parking lot again. There was still no sign of which way the man had gone when he left. When the operator spoke, I haltingly tried to explain what had happened. They asked me to clarify a few times, understandably confused. But finally, they said police were on their way and to not touch anything further. After the longest wait I'd ever experienced, flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness outside. The authorities had arrived, though I had no idea how to actually show them what I'd found. This was beyond anything I could have imagined happening when my shift started earlier that evening. 2 police cruisers pulled up outside, their flashing lights giving an eerie glow to the shadowy parking lot. My heart pounded as I wondered how to explain this to them. An officer tapped on the glass door, startling me from my panicked thoughts. I unlocked the door with fumbling hands and let the 2 uniformed cops inside. They asked me to explain what was going on, faces etched with concern. I gestured helplessly to the abandoned bag still sitting innocuously on the counter. The officers looked inside and immediately reacted with alarm to the sight of the wrapped-up eyeball. They quickly confirmed I hadn't tampered with it further or moved it since calling 911. I recounted the entire bizarre and unsettling encounter with the muttering man earlier that evening. The authorities agreed I'd done exactly the right thing by contacting them about such a disturbing discovery. They carefully bagged up the eyeball as evidence and took my statement. I asked, shakily, if they had any idea how something like this could happen. The older officer just shook his head grimly, unable to provide any reasonable explanation. After what felt like hours, the police finally left with the bag and the eyeball, promising to be in touch if they learned anything. I locked the door behind them, utterly exhausted from shock and adrenaline. All I could do was go home and attempt to process the night's events. In the following days, I agonized over whether I should have done more to figure out who that man was, or if I could have prevented him leaving with no answers. But the authorities assured me I did the right thing by not engaging further and calling them basically right away. To this day, I still don't know where that eyeball came from, or why the man had it concealed in his bag. I never heard any follow-up from the police about it either. It still haunts me to think about it sometimes, the utter strangeness of that random Tuesday night so many years ago. I'm just relieved knowing I reported the disturbing discovery, so at the very least, it could be properly investigated. One day they'll all be bald. From Snipit. For a bit of background, I got my haircutting license in high school. It was a great program and only cost about 10% of what other options did. In our senior year, brands or companies would come to the school to try to push their products or recruit us. One salon that came was a sport-themed men's salon chain. I'm sure you can Google it and find it quickly. When I got older, I realized it was like the salon version of Hooters. All the stylists were women, and we had to wear black leggings and flattering uniform tops. But as a green, clueless 18-year-old eager to get into the field, the pay was really great. I have many horror stories from that place. The guys there could be creeps. Working there, I developed really bad anxiety and resentment toward men, but I've since gotten better. Allow me to share 2 stories out of the many from my time there. The first one was about 4 months into working at the salon. My sweet older coworker Lou and I had the opening shift. She and I set everything up and opened up for a slow Tuesday morning. After an hour of staring out the salon windows, a normal-looking guy with a briefcase stepped inside. He wasn't dressed fancy or formal, but he had a very sophisticated briefcase with him. It was a little odd, but he greeted me just fine, so I took him back to my salon chair. As I was about to drape him, I noticed he had his briefcase on his lap. To be kind, I let him know he could leave his things on top of my salon booth. He turned to me with a straight face and said, "Oh, you wouldn't like what I have in here." I felt a chill down my spine. I never asked him what was in it. I really didn't want to know. I was simply there to provide comfort. I cleared my throat and replied as non-threateningly as possible, "No need to tell me, but the offer stands if you change your mind." I didn't make small talk. I just wanted to get him out of there as soon as possible. My coworker went to sit in the break room, and there was no way for me to inform her about the panic filling me. I must have finished his cut in record time. At the end, he started giving me a crazy shooter vibe. So I began saying how beautiful the day was outside, hoping that whatever plans he had went well. His straight face broke into a smile, and I felt the tension fall. I finished, rang him up, and he and his briefcase left. I don't know what was in there, but I'm glad I never found out. The following story is one that still haunts me when I'm in another tension-filled customer service situation. It was a rush at the salon, and there were only 3 of us. Me, Jesse, and Diamond. Jessie was a short but amazing stylist. People would wait hours for her. She didn't take crap from others. Diamond was a sweet southern 6-foot stylist who really cared about all of us and made me feel safe working there. I took another client to my chair after hours of nonstop rush with a full lobby. Another important fact is that we're near a military base and offer military discounts. Most of our clients are from the Air Force. I can't remember if this guy was, but he was about 6 feet and had RBF, resting B face if you know what I mean. Otherwise, he was polite. He told me what he wanted and I started to snip away, making pleasant conversation. I asked if his cut was looking good, as I was almost finished. He looked at the mirror, smiled, and said it was good. I finished off the top and put my tools down. I saw his expression in the mirror change. He frowned. I began to get nervous. I asked if everything was okay. He told me one side was not even. I was confused because a minute ago he said he was good. I wasn't seeing where it was uneven either. I asked him to point it out for me, now feeling a little anxious because he seemed a little too angry. His attitude was a complete 180 for seemingly no reason. At this point, I had clients yelling at me, but this guy seemed so angry, his eyes almost glazing over, veins popping out of his forehead. He started to scream at me, saying that I ruined his hair and it looked terrible. Maybe this isn't scary to most people, but I just turned 18 and was 4'11", and this was a grown man yelling at me in a salon full of grown, mostly military men. I realize now I should not have been the one embarrassed. He should have. I started to tear up then and told him to calm down. I would get Diamond to fix it for him. Diamond came over and kindly asked him what the problem was. He calmed down a little, seeing how tall Diamond was. He explained, still angry, that I ruined his hair, and it was uneven. She really did try her best to see what the heck he was talking about, but she said it looked fine. She offered to take the other side of his head down a little, so it would be even. At this point, it occurred to me that maybe he was trying to get his hair cut for free. Also, for more context, the reason I was paranoid about this behavior is that I've always been a true crime nerd. I've heard countless stories of people getting hurt for simply looking at someone funny. I didn't want to die in the salon at age 18. He continued to throw a fit in the store, and by then the other men were glaring at him. He ripped off the cape I put around him and towered over me, telling me he was not paying for this. I was so scared and just wanted to burst into tears. I know I was surrounded by men, but this guy was inches away from me. He could have hurt me before anyone got to me. I tried my best to collect myself and told him to have a nice day. He stormed off to the front of the store, and I lingered behind because I had to check him off our computer system in order for me to appear as available for the next client in the system. The man took this as a sign that I would be charging him for the cut and stopped at the counter with me. He angrily flared his nostrils, screaming only a foot or so away from my face that he was not paying. I nodded and told him, "No, you aren't. Have a nice day." I saw his eyes change, like he was upset that I was arguing with him about it. But I just wanted him to leave so I could run to the back and start sobbing. I saw his hand hover over one of his pockets and I panicked, thinking he was going to do something. But he looked around our still crowded lobby full of men glaring at him. His stance relaxed and he stomped out. I was relieved, and I then fast walked to the back, shaking and crying. At the end of the day, the man had stayed until we closed. He just sat in his car waiting. I was mortified, but luckily, 2 people always had to close, and Diamond always made a point to walk me to my car. Everyone went home safely, and I made sure he didn't follow me home. Just remembering this event makes me extremely emotional. I know it could have been worse, but being so young and fresh in that field, it was a very harrowing experience. The solace that I have found is that most men go bald around their 30s, so one day terrible men won't have the privilege of terrorizing salons anymore. Just please be nice to stylists. They are people too, and are mostly happy to accept mistakes and fix them. Now, 5 years later, I work in a cushy office, and from time to time I do have to answer calls from customers. When one gets upset, I find myself starting to breathe a little heavier and panicking, remembering how that guy acted when he got upset. Well, stay safe out there, stylists. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.